Hello and welcome to my coverage on warrior tanking for Everbloom. This will serve as a basic tutorial for understanding how to warrior tank. It's not an end-all be-all. I'm by no means a pro, but I definitely am a veteran. So, beginning straight off the first pull, consider how many mobs we have. 3 mobs, medium damage, medium health. As a warrior tank, I know I'll have to immediately generate 60 rage off the charge. That's why I opened up with a stun in order to hold off on any damage that I would initially take, and then use shield block and barrier with the extra rage I would have. I knew that one revenge, one shield slam, and the straight charge would give me enough to shield block immediately. By then the mobs would be coming out of stun. The next pack that I look at, I heroic leap into, and that's for the immediate damage. By now the group has an idea of how fast I'm going to pull, and it's important to generate threat immediately. If you aren't going to go as aggressive as I am here in this case, because I outgear the dungeon I'm able to, and you'll see even for a moment I dropped to maybe 30%, but I had cooldowns ready and I do actually pop those. Now, the smaller plants don't hit very hard and they have minimal movement speed. This means it's very easy to kite them even if you don't apply any slows yourself. So after the heroic leap, an immediate thunderclap in order to get deep wounds rolling on them and really maximize the damage. You'll see for a moment I spike up to about 60 and end up leveling off and averaging 30k to the DPS. It has become more of a huge deal, especially in this expansion over others. As a tank, the amount that you can contribute to damage is rather significant. So the next step, and I think they may have fixed this, and if they haven't then they're going to, and that would be the ability to ride up this ridge into the next boss. So for a few moments you're just going to watch me fail at that. I'm probably going to fast forward a little bit over that. Okay, now that we've fast forwarded past the fail, we can move into the next pull, where I do get an MD, so threat is not going to be of the biggest concern. Not that it would be either way, but as I figure we can stay far to the right, I was going to opt for the heroic leap straight into those mobs, but since we took such a long pause, I didn't bother. Only because I wouldn't have enough rage to trigger off any mitigation. So instead, I opened straight away for damage because the mobs are easy enough to burn. And you notice in this case we actually end up getting an additional pack pulled along with Nullroot, and that's okay. You'll see that I pop Ravager on the group afterward, and that's because of the 30% parry, which allows you to boost up a massive amount of rage early. And keep in mind that every subsequent parry will give you what you need to do a revenge. Seeing as the targets are clustered, the revenge will hit its max of 3 mobs very easily. Sorry, max of 2 mobs very easily. And it will allow me to generate enough rage to put up defensives immediately. And in this case, you'll notice as I start to drop low, I see that there's 30 seconds left on my self-heal, so I can't rely on that, but I can start to back away. And while I can't rely on the self-heal, I can rely on Victory Rush after taking down one of the mobs. That comes pretty easily with the nature of the damage that goes through. So if you find yourself with a large pack like this, and you need to slowly make your way out, it's always a good idea to kite them just a little bit and drop a shockwave and see if you can kill the lowest health one. If you have to blow and execute, fine, so be it. It'll get you the additional victory rush, which is a large portion of your health back until defensives are back up. And at this point I also realized that I was slowing the mobs with Glyph of Hindering Strikes, which is fine, but I generally use that for PvP. The Glyph of Cleave is what I'm going to switch to in this case. I generally run that because of the amount of damage I'm able to contribute. So this next step, I have to make an assessment. Another pack of small mobs. Again, they're medium health, low damage, and now with the new improved Glyph of Cleave, I can run a pretty decent amount of damage through on them. And pretty much that initial damage that I put in is more than enough. I can start to move away immediately. And when I do, I charge to a new target, generate some additional rage, and get straight to it. Keep in mind that when it comes to the choice of talent, I do run the double charge just for the mobility. However, it's not always the most superior choice. Sometimes the stun is helpful. If you have packs that can be stunned, it can serve as an additional interrupt. And a lot of people tend to rule out Juggernaut just because it only reduces the cooldown to 12 seconds rather than giving you 2 charges over the full duration. But do keep in mind that off the double charges, if you're charging the same target, you cannot generate rage twice. If you're having issues with rage management, it might be better to go with Juggernaut because you can get rage twice. And if you consider it in a 12-second span, and if you run the Glyph of Bull Rush, you can generate almost an entire rage bar over the course of 24 seconds from your initial touchdown, not counting any shield slam or revenge use or procs that you get there and from using devastate or revenge. Now, some of the stuff I've been talking about is a bit more common to people who have already been warrior tanking for some time, so I'll just go over a few basics for those who have not, because I did mention this would be somewhat of a tutorial and it seems unfair to leave those out. So, for some of the basic coverage, something to consider in warrior tanking, you want to keep up your shield block and shield barrier as much as possible. Shield block more so than barrier, but because block does have a cooldown, if you can generate extra rage to fend off damage, it's a good idea. And if you do have shield block up, it's a significant bit of reduction actually. It adds up to being a lot. And also it scales with the new form of vengeance. While it doesn't increase our damage, it certainly doesn't need to. The self heals that it proclaims to increase, that's where it's going for the barrier. So as a Prot warrior, rage management won't be hard. Your 2 primary abilities, Shield Slam and Revenge, give 20 rage apiece, and they can be reset. Now, the resetting part is what I'm going to speak about because that's the biggest deal. Something to consider as Prot is that your Devastate, which is your filler move, can reset your Shield Slam, which is your primary move. And by parrying, you can reset Revenge. One of them is a little more out of your hands, especially since as a stackable stat, parry has been removed. But it is balanced out with Ravager now being added. So with the ability to call on an additional 30% parry, you can more or less control when you're going to be able to drop a lot of revenge. And keep in mind, a lot of people will tell you strictly shield slam over revenge constantly, but Prot is becoming less and less of a rotation and more of a priority. So when you want to consider how to run in a priority situation, if you're fighting multiple mobs and you're running Ravager, it's perfectly acceptable to use the Ravager and then begin spamming revenge. You'll actually get more damage out of it if there are more than 2 mobs and if they're constantly attacking, so if they're physical mobs. If they're caster mobs though, I don't recommend this. For caster, just try to gain as much rage as you can and use Devastate. That way you can shield slam as much as possible, giving you the additional rage that you would need in order to shield barrier as much as you can, and also spell reflect when you can. Know what you can spell reflect and know what you can't. Between interrupt, spell reflects, and just any other kind of avoidance that you have built in there, and absorptions that you get from your barrier, warriors are very solid at avoiding taking any more damage than they need to from spells. I'd say second only to DKs. Technically, Paladins could out-absorb us on the spell situation, but they would have to not run their glyph that I've noticed many Paladins do, which is the ability to keep 40% reduction straight away. So something else to consider, this is a little more advanced warrior tanking, this will help set you apart from the pack. The understanding that bosses and mobs have swing timers, and if you pay attention, if you can pull out enough to pay attention, I would recommend a good way to do it is scouting a dungeon. Go in as DPS and just watch closely. You can find out exactly what mob swing timers are. Now, what do I mean by swing timers? Usually the base swing timer since BC has been around 2 seconds. Every boss mob averages out about 2 seconds. Some do have swing combinations, and I'll discuss that a little bit later. But mobs have a 2-second swing timer or so. This boss, for example, has one that is about 2 seconds. And he'll constantly raise his hand, swing, then you can count 1, 2, swing, count 1, to swing. Now, the reason this is so imperative is that your shield block lasts for 6 seconds. If you were to use shield block after the boss hits you, you essentially block only 2 moves. You're wasting 2 seconds of that. If you wait until just before the boss raises his hand, you get in 3 hits worth. That's not factoring in any RNG, because keep in mind that dodge and parry are both calculated before block comes into account. To explain how the series works, when a mob first goes to swing at you, consider it in the way that they would write it in code. It first calculates and checks against your dodge. Did the warrior dodge? No. Did the warrior parry? No. And then, if neither of that has happened, then it will go directly into you being hit. Then it'll calculate your block and etc., reduction, bonus armor, so on. But that being said, if you watch mob swing timers, you can get the most out of your block. Being only 6 seconds with a built-in cooldown, it's important to watch that. Also, you have to keep in mind that you can overlap your block, and you want to avoid doing so if ever possible. At this point, I'm just clearing a few more things. I don't think much more needs explaining on that front, but I am going to talk a little bit about stats. Keep in mind that some situation on the stats are a little bit up in the air, and don't blindly trust anyone on it. Don't trust me per se yet. Do your own research, figure out what fits best for you, because when it comes to warrior stats, you can actually be pretty well spread out. You will want to have mastery and crit, of course. Now, for the explanation on crit, the more you crit, the more rage you get from it. The more rage you get, the more sustainable defense, more sustainable offense. So, crit's always a primary, it's always a good one to have. Mastery will increase your block and critical block. That's a significant bit. Although it still does come down to RNG, blocking and critical blocking can lead to larger damage reduction than anything else. What I mean by this, if a mob hits you for 100,000, a barrier will only stop maybe 10k of that. If you're fully buffed up, it can do a little more. But a block will reduce it by a whopping 30%. A crit block will do a little more than that. So mastery is imperative, but there are other stats now that have a purpose. Bonus armor being flat damage reduction and an increase as well to attack power. So it's an all-in-one tanking stat, being a replacement for dodge and parry now. Now, just to interrupt from that explanation to go a little bit into the pull, you'll notice I pulled something incredibly large, and again I went into a kiting strat. As a tank, it's important to know when to kite and when to hold still. A lot of the mechanics that they're putting in now for Draenor are openly dodgeable. It's a pretty interesting way of doing it. They've put a lot more power in the tank's hands. Once upon a time you stood still, you got hit, and every fight was pretty much a gear check. Now what they're doing is allowing you as the tank to evade more things personally. Physically walk away from something, or using your direct moves now with active mitigation. I think it's a much better system, speaking as a veteran player. Now, the kite strat, it's a big deal for those of you who may have done challenge modes. Some of you might not be experienced with that, but mastering how to kite mobs instead of directly taking them to the face, that is how you will be able to complete challenge modes, even in this one as well. There's no better mitigation than simply not being hit at all. Avoidance always beats just raw soaking in that way. At least what you can control. So you'll constantly see me kind of backing away from mobs, and you'll notice that mobs have an outstretched reach and distance. You should pay close attention to that. The distance that they have lets you figure out whether or not it's okay at that point, or safe, to turn your back or at least your side. Keep in mind that if you have your back turned to a mob, you can't block, you can't parry. You can dodge, but you definitely don't want to rely on just one kind of avoidance at any time. So bear that in mind. But you'll notice a few of the times as I'm kiting away from some of these mobs, you'll see that I reach just about maybe 8 yards from the target, because that's about the longest melee swing that I've encountered, and I step away. You'll also notice that Blade Storm has about an 8-yard range. Keep that in mind as well. If you can do it, you can afford to Blade Storm the target and stay just out of their physical reach. The reason that I tend to like to do this is because during Blade Storm, Yes, you can still use your mitigation moves. However, you tend to get your rage tends to plateau because you can't quite generate it anymore. You can't use Shield Slam and you can't use Revenge. That's why many times Bloodbath is a better use than Blade Storm. However, if you exceed a certain number of targets, then yeah, Blade Storm's the fantastic way to go. I'll talk a little more in detail about those two right now, actually. Bloodbath has an extreme use. The snare, for one thing, is fantastic for when you have to uh, kite as a tank. And the damage is not quite as high as Blade Storm, but you can still use abilities while you're doing that. So bear that in mind. If you have a lower gear score or you're concerned about how much damage you're going to take in an engagement, it's almost always better to go with Bloodbath because you can still use your avoidance techniques, you can still use your active mitigation. Also, if you can help it, especially during long fights, avoid using Blade Storm when your shield block is up to 2 charges, unless you know you're sitting on a full pool of rage. I say that because you should have your shield wall either straight off on cooldown because you've used them and you're out of charges, or you should be having enough rage that you can still use the shield block while in your Blade Storm. You don't want to get caught off guard and take a huge amount of damage at that time. It's important to think about the healers. Now, positioning is another key thing as a tank. You'll notice constantly with this boss, I dip in and out of his circle and avoid being slammed by him. And I also try to move him away from the melee DPS whenever possible. That way they have to do less avoiding. Another thing that you'll realize, and especially when doing challenge modes later on, is that evading hits like those, it's a big deal. Doing that evasion for the melee is essentially making their life easier, maximizing DPS, meaning the healer has to heal for less time. It's something entirely better. There's only upsides to doing it. Also, if you're not running the Shield Slam glyph, you should do that. That is the only glyph I consider 100% priority here, or in any dungeon for that matter. As Prot, it's the one thing you must have. The ability to purge targets is a huge deal. And keep in mind, watch your purges, watch your interrupts, they're the most important thing. It's something that people have to switch to from the mop mind state. You can't simply burst everything down. The guy who is at top DPS is not actually top DPS if he hasn't been interrupting things, if he hasn't been dispelling, cleansing, so on. Those are much more important. So this boss fight was pretty basic. The strategy just called for killing the heals first. You kind of let the melee guy do what he wants for the most part until the end. And I mentioned that in such a way that you'll notice I just keep evading his moves because most of it is evadable. He does hit incredibly hard, and it's something you have to bear in mind. But he also does stick to the basic 2-second swing timer, and you can count between each hit. 1, 2, swing. 1, 2, swing. And then his Noxus Eruption takes 3 seconds, giving you more than enough time to get out of it and to maximize your shield block mitigation against him. So that's why he's ignorable. Avoid what he does. If you're getting hit by it, you're going to end up taking too much damage in, and you'll make too much of a distraction for the healer, and the DPS is going to have to be concerned about themselves and not pushing straight through. So the strat on that is pretty simple. Down the heals first, then kill the caster, then worry about the melee guy. One good idea to do if you don't want to run directly over to the caster immediately, you can get on the healer, begin DPSing him down. You can do something like drop your Mocking Banner, and this will just constantly taunt them to you. That way the DPS doesn't have to concern themselves with the opener. You can focus on the mob that you're trying to put down, and for the DPS they can focus that one as well without worrying about losing aggro or anything like that. It gives you time to generate threat on each one of them. Also bear in mind that you can intervene to the Mocking Banner. There is a macro on that, and for another video I can do a display of some of the macros that I use. That will just give you another step of increased mobility. It works into the kiting strat. Unfortunately, I don't have any cause to use it here, or at least that kiting strat, so you won't quite see me do the intervene, but another one of the times that I'll be running the dungeons or in one of my PvP videos you'll see me use it constantly, and I'll do a tutorial on that as well on how to make the most use of it. Now for this next section, I think we're actually going to be sitting by a moment while someone takes an AFK break. While he's doing that, I'll discuss a few more intricacies on warrior stats because I left off talking about some of the basics: crit, mastery. Now, haste. Haste is one of the new things, and some of you may have noticed leveling that haste keeps getting stuck on all your gear, and it's annoying as hell because prior, as a warrior, when I say prior, I'm talking about since existence, about a decade, haste has been pretty bad for warriors. You may find some guides out there telling you to stack haste. It's a great way to get wrecked. Um, but I could see why in theory crafting some people might look at it. Technically, more haste equals more shield slam equals more rage. But crit can do an entirely better job of that, and it does a better job of keeping you in place. So I'm going to be experimenting with haste, and I've done a little bit so far, and a part of the reason I could see some use for haste is, for one, the glad stance warriors out there. If you have enough haste, you can get off an additional shield slam without the need of a proc during the duration of shield charge. For Prot, if you're using heavy repercussions, you can get an additional shield slam through enough haste during a duration of a shield block, so you can get off 2 more shield slams and so on, because that 6-second number is key. Now, the thing is, the amount that haste does is what leaves it in a tricky scenario. I'm going to do tests of haste at different levels, and if it's requested, I'll make a video on it. I'll show how haste looks for Prot at the 7.5 soft cap. I'll show it at the next cap up, and so on. So I'll do the math, maybe everywhere between the 7.5 soft cap, where I think I'm going to stick my haste, and probably up to the point of as much haste I can muster. I think 23% is probably the most I can really get out of there, 23 to 25. But I'll run some figures on the numbers based on what I get there. Now, that being said, I haven't run the numbers on haste yet. Feel free to do that yourself if you'd like to, and if you want to use it, fine, but I don't strongly advise it. Multi-strike, the new addition. Well, multi-strike and versatility, I'll discuss both at once. For multi-strike, it's incredibly useful, especially for maximizing that damage. If you get additional shield slams or additional revenges, I don't really much need to explain just how much extra damage that comes out to being, but I will anyway, just because it's fantastic and someone should say something about it. Okay, so revenge already hits multiple targets, and when you get multi-strike, that is considered into it. Next thing, you'll notice that it seems like I'm proccing things at a pretty obscene rate. Sword and board is almost always up when I begin using Devastate and so on. But you'll notice my Devastate, and you'll see it does like an average of 5 to 8,000 depending on the target, sometimes crits for upwards of 15 to 18. But you'll see that there's a smaller number of Devastate directly afterward, and that is because there's multi-strike going on. And it appears, I haven't fully tested yet, but it appears that the multi-strike is counting toward that as well. So if multi-strike is counting toward the proc chance for Devastate, which already has a fairly high proc chance, it's going to be a phenomenal stat. Same thing with versatility. An increase in damage and a reduction in damage taken seems like a no-brainer. But, and here comes the but, when using these stats, I have to recommend caution because it's hard to get enough of them to really make it worthwhile. Not so much on the multi-strike end, because any multi-strike is still something, and even a chance at that proc is good. I can't recall my exact multi-strike stats. I'll do a video listing out each one of my stats just to kind of show how it's going to be done and how it plays out at each ranking of multi-strike for what I can muster this early in. Versatility, now that's the stat where I kind of have some problem. And I say this because it seems that we can only get it in small portions at this time. And so low versatility doesn't pan out to much for reduction. You end up getting a few percentage points, which can be something, because keep in mind, some warriors are going to spec into Glad Stance just for the 5% reduction. because 5% can be a lot, especially against a raid boss, and that may be the same thing with versatility. You get a certain number of versatility points, you get 5–10% reduction, and you're looking at a lot right there. It's a sizable amount. Now here, I clearly overplay my hand. I guess, I don't know, we're a little cocky after the last boss, and was not considering just how bad this Dragon Breath was going to be if I got 2 of these Pyromancers at a time. So unfortunately it does lead to a wipe, and that's another thing. Never be too overzealous. If you've done well, that's great, but right here I kind of put myself too far in. I've also got to disable my quartz mod, so you can watch me wipe as I discuss that. But the mod in the center, it's designed to show what they're casting and how much time it goes. But after the release of the expansion, it started to break, and I have no idea what the hell it's doing now, except just showing up random things. It annoys the fuck out of me. But yeah, here it's a kind of admirable attempt, but I end up going down, and so does everyone else shortly after, and it's mainly because I underestimated the mirror images that they summon afterward. So after a short run back, I'll probably just clip through this. After a short run back, then we get straight through to the boss, and now this is one where I'm going to discuss the positioning part again, because that's what's important here. Notice the spores that move around, they're almost barely visible. If you have your graphics on low, you should probably kick it up a little bit just so you can see the spores and all the effects she's going to leave on the floor, because there's a sizable amount. That being said, you'll want to tank her off to the far side in order to actually see what she's doing and actually be able to jump over all the fire rings and not get caught in the spores. If your DPS by some chance gets caught in a spore and they're asleep for 3 seconds and they get nailed by a bunch of fire rings, the heals will either not be able to keep them up or struggle to keep them and you up at the same time. You never want to really make that an option. What I mentioned before about keeping things in your ballpark as much as possible, it levies in pretty big here. You need to be able to mitigate as much of the group's damage as possible by bearing the burden yourself. So if you just don't put the DPS in a situation to get hit by any environmental effects, you're essentially dodging things for them. So when we get through to this boss, I kind of pull her back into the corner, and we're able to evade almost every hit that she dishes out for a while. So it's a pretty big deal in terms of keeping the DPS alive and making her a much more simple engagement. But there is a point where things start to go awry on her, and that is when she gets to her second phase, and I end up blowing my interrupt on something that she has so I can kind of mitigate a little bit of damage. It was a bad choice. It was an easy mistake to have made. Because she gets off her next cast, which makes her a little easier to fight afterward. However, when she does, she ends up doing a lot more damage. If at ever possible, just pay close attention to what you're going to be interrupting and what you're going to be spell reflecting and so on. This can be a little more difficult when you're in a pub group, because organizing this can be a little tough. If you are in a pub and there's no real option to discuss with them when interrupts are going to happen and so on, don't waste your spell reflect. Try your best not to. So watch for it. If you see an interrupt happen, you can wait and maybe spell reflect the next shot afterward. That way you know that the next person who blew their interrupt is not going to do it, and you know you're not going to blow your own. If you can chat with your partners or whoever else you're in group with, go ahead and mention it. You're going to interrupt the next, no need to, you're going to reflect the next, no need to interrupt it. Also consider what is reflectable. It's generally just direct target spells, not much else in that area. This last boss, Yalnu, he's a great example of execution over anything else. So for this boss, he's pretty simple once you get the hang of it. He's going to randomly entangle a mob. It can be either one of the players or one of the casting mages. The mages do a huge portion of work, especially on the ads that come out. The larger ads, you'll have to pick them up yourself. It's a good idea to drop a banner if you don't want to run all the way over. The ad will come to you. You've got more than enough time. That being the case, if you don't have the banner up, you could use the Ravager. I don't fully recommend it because they'll only get hit by a small part of it. And also, on the rare chance that you end up getting entangled, call that shit out hard, because it can really it can throw everything off. You'll see right there I get entangled and I'm not able to pick up the ads afterward. There's some extra damage going out. If the group was less efficient, that honestly could lead to what is a wipe later. But keeping the mages alive for an encounter like this, it's a pretty big deal, because they do a huge portion of the damage. They wipe the ads out and they take care of that for you. When he goes into his next phase, and he does like his own version of tranquility, and you'll see the small flower spawning. Your group just has to spread out and step on all of them. As the warrior tank, it's a good idea to aim for the furthest ones, because you have better mobility than most other people. Consider this carefully based on your group composition. If you know you have a group that can handle most of it, don't concern yourself too much. But otherwise, it's a pretty good idea to heroic leap to the furthest target, step on all of them, and you're good and through. I think that covers just about everything I wanted to for now. Thanks for watching. If you guys have any other requests besides the videos I mentioned, macros and otherwise, let me know.